Hey guys, welcome to the podcast. Today we actually have a great episode for you guys. Unfortunately, however, the internet connection was not great during this podcast, so we lost a little bit of the audio quality. However, I thought it was such a good recording, and I was so happy to have Xan Barksdale on the podcast for this one that I wanted to bring it to you guys anyway. I really hope that I'm able to bring him back in the future for another podcast, but I didn't want to waste this one. I know there's a lot of great things that you guys can glean off this podcast, especially for our catchers. Go ahead and take a listen to it. Try to bear with the audio. There's some great points, and it does clean up in a few spots. So stick with it, and we'll see you guys in the next podcast. Thanks for joining us here, and I always appreciate the support. In the Name of Overhead Athletics podcast, where we cover rehabilitation, biomechanics, human movement, and optimizing human performance. Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today I'm joined by a catching expert. Little different. We've talked to motor learning specialists, we've talked to rehabilitation professionals, and today we're talking to Xan Barksdale. Xan is a former player who's now a coach. He's coached at Louisville. He played baseball at Ole Miss, and he's played some professional baseball as well. And his specialty is really in training catchers and coaching baseball at the highest level. So welcome to the podcast here, Xan.
Max, thanks for having me. I appreciate you inviting me on, and you have a lot of nice things to say, but honestly, I'm looking forward to learning from you. You got a lot of degrees on your wall, and I know you do a lot of good things, so I'm looking forward to
They're not all mine
as well.
They're not all mine.
You don't have to tell people that. That's okay.
Here. My fiancés are over here, so yeah.
Hey,
so,
well, guilty by association.
Yeah, I said, all right, I'll put mine on this side. We'll put yours over here. She's an occupational therapist, so it's pretty. We got the therapy duo over here.
There you go.
So talk to me a little bit, because you have some unique experience in that you've played baseball at probably the most vast. I guess you have the most vast experience in terms of level of play as a player yourself. Talk to me a little bit about that and how that interplays with your coaching, because you went from the junior college level to a really large Division I school in the SEC, and then on to professional baseball from there. And you've also coached at multiple schools. So, what have you garnered, I guess, or what have you taken from that experience?
Well, that's a very good question, and I definitely appreciate you asking, because I do feel like I've been at a lot of different levels between coaching and playing, and I've seen a lot of different things happen at different levels. That whether it be with USA baseball in the summer, or coaching in college, or playing professionally. I think the first thing that I'd like to point out is, yeah, even though I played at a big Division I professionally, I have never claimed to be the greatest player or greatest catcher on earth. I feel like I've really excelled in the coaching side of it, much more than my playing career. So with that said, I do think that I learned a lot of lessons playing, and to kind of briefly recap on what you said, I played in a small high school. I tore my ACL my junior year, so I wasn't recruited heavily. I wasn't one of these big-time recruits. I was a senior in high school wearing a giant knee brace. So I went to a junior college, which for me was an excellent decision. I played at Holmes Community College, where I developed and had an opportunity to move on. Then I spent a couple of years at Ole Miss. After 2 years there, I signed a contract with the Braves, played in 4 or 5 different levels there, I think, and then got into coaching, where I spent 5 years at the University of Louisville, and then I spent 4 years at East Tennessee State. And after I got out of the college coaching side of it, I got involved with USA Baseball, and I've worked with those guys as young as 13 or 14, all the way up to college age guys. And I still do a little bit of work with some different guys in pro ball. But yeah, I've definitely seen a lot of different levels and a lot of different areas, and I do think that's kind of helped shape a lot of the way that I look at things. You don't always communicate with a 13 or 14-year-old the same way you would communicate with a 21 or 22-year-old. Yes, are the mechanics the same? Yeah, for the most part. But what I found is really different is the communication styles, the learning styles, and that's something that I've really tried to adapt to how I work with guys and how I teach. I try to explain it to where anybody can understand or anybody can relate. But at the same time, you kind of have to let the player dictate how rapidly they're willing to move on, depending on how quickly they pick up the material.
Absolutely. What would you say is your hierarchy of coaching? Because the human body is the human body. You're gonna move very similar if you move well as an adult that you did as a child. And we see a lot of the stuff online now is like, look at this 2-year-old squatting or 3-year-old squatting all the way down. You should be able to do that as an adult as well, which is absolutely true. But as far as baseball coaching, you know, playing at the college level, you see that the emphasis placed on catching a lot of times is insufficient. Especially, I played at the NAI level, and at the NAI level, they don't have the funds to have a catching coach, a pitching coach, an infield coach, outfield coach, a hitting coach, and all a coach for every domain. And with catching being so unique, what are the things that we're missing out on, I guess, just from a general practice structure that kind of fit into your hierarchy? Like, hey, here's the low hanging fruit, and here's where we need to start with our catchers because they are so unique.
Absolutely, and I think that's a great place to start with it because the position is unique and the position is different. We have to train catchers differently than we train pitchers, or we train corner infielders or corner outfielders because the position requires a different skill set. I think the best example that I can give with this, mobility and ankle mobility. I typically work with guys who are a little bit older. They're later on in high school or they're in the college. I've just started working with a couple of younger guys who are in that 12 or 13-year-old range. And like those guys, and kind of like you mentioned, I definitely think you train the athlete first. We don't get too deep. Let's make them a more athletic, more well-balanced athlete before we get super specific beyond that. However, one of the things that I've noticed that just doesn't get the attention that it needs is hip mobility and ankle mobility, especially the catchers. There's so many guys that they don't throw the way they want to, they don't receive the way they want to, or the way they'd like to, simply because they can't get into a good position because they're super tight in their hips or they're super tight in their ankles, and their body just doesn't allow them like they want to. So I've even presented on it a couple times. I the things that needs to change in baseball, and I think it's getting better, but we're not all the way there yet, is if you go to a team's practice or watch a team before a game, when they're stretching and when they're getting loose and they're doing their dynamic warm-up, for the most part, everybody's doing the exact same thing, which to me kind of blows my mind. Now, I don't think we need, if we have 40 players on the team, I don't think we necessarily need 40 different routines, but I think we can definitely group guys in similar categories that say, hey, these guys need a little bit more emphasis on or hip mobility or arm care or whatever it is, and kind of generate a routine that's built for them and it focuses on what they need. So that, for example, our pitchers may not be working on the exact same thing that our catchers are working on. But I believe that the catchers should spend time on arm care, just like all the position players, and pitchers as well. But they got to spend a lot of time on hip mobility, ankle mobility. And I think we can start with changing the routine before the game and kind of trying to tailor it to what the individual needs, and not just saying, hey, everybody, let's go all through the same routine and treat everybody with a cookie cutter approach.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really interesting approach, because it gets neglected, and you get guys that really do need something unique. Like, I just had a catcher, and I've worked with him in the past. Great kid. He's a senior in high school. He's on that recruiting route right now, and he just had hip surgery because he had a cam lesion in his hip. He had a ton of impingement in his hip, and what he does for his warm up is going to have to be different than the other catchers are the people going down the dynamic warm up line. If you have him do lateral lunges to the side or these extreme rotations through the hip, he's going to have problems because he's going to impinge himself. And now that he's had surgery, hopefully that'll free him up a little bit. But especially for catching, because you're down in the deep squat position all the time. You have to be able to move laterally in that position. So that's a great point. And I had never even placed too much thought into dynamic warm up difference or variation for catchers, but that's a great comment, because I'm always thinking about that for pitchers. What do my guys that are throwing the ball 100 times at a high intensity need to do different than the guys who have to field and throw it 3 times a game type of thing.
Sure. So the approach that I take with that, and I'd love to get your feedback as well. I think what works best as a coach or an instructor or a therapist or somebody in the medical field. I think for the most part, we can guide our players, or we can guide our catchers, or any of the players, and get input from them as well. So for example, if we want our players to go through, let's just say each day they have 5 hip mobility exercises. Okay, and I'm just making this up off the top of my head. Well, maybe the first 3 are directed by the coach or the therapist or the instructor, and they say, hey, these are the ones I really want us working on. When we ask the player for input and say, and kind of let them get some ownership of developing their program, I feel like we got a lot better results. So maybe the coach, directs the first 3, and then maybe the last 2, which is 40% of the program, we get input from the player and say, hey, which exercises do you really feel? Which ones do you feel like work well for you? So a great example with the guy you used that's had an injury, or maybe has some mobility issues or some impingements or whatever it might be. The exercises that he does might not be the same as the exercises that I do, might not be the same as the exercises that you do. So what we're doing, we're accomplishing a couple things with that. Yes, we're allowing guys to get work in, but we're also getting their feedback so we get ownership and buy-in from them. But also, man, who's to tell the player that this stretch is not better than that one, or this exercise is not better than that one? Because I am a firm believer that we can make blanket statements, but it's also good to get their feedback and listen to them. And if they say, hey, this exercise it checks the boxes that I like, then boom, we add that one in, and that might not be the same for everybody.
Yeah, it's all about options. The way I've thought about, especially flexibility in catchers, is basically like if you're wearing a tight pair of jeans and you can't squat to the ground. If that's your mobility or your flexibility, you're truly limiting yourself. You're operating like basically inside of an exoskeleton, and you're losing out on potential solutions to the issues that you face in the game. Hey, there's an outside pitch, and I gotta slide over, and then I gotta back pick this guy at first or whatever it is. If I'm operating inside of a constrained environment based on just my movement capability, I'm really limiting myself. By getting more flexible, having better range of motion, I'm opening up options that I have as an athlete, which is even more important when you're speeding the game up as you go up levels of play. You might get away with that at 12U baseball when you got to throw it 70 feet to first base. But when you're throwing it 90 feet and everybody runs a lot faster, it's a different ball game.
I absolutely agree 100%. And I think one of the principles that I try to live by and teach by and coach with is I don't believe in necessarily the quick fix. Like, hey, if you come to my camp, I'm not going to promise, hey, gain 10 miles an hour in the next 2 days. Like, I don't do that thing. I don't really believe in the quick fixes and the overselling and the snake oil. However, I will say a lot of the worked with make some really incredible improvements over a very short period of time when it comes to their body and it comes to their flexibility and mobility and stability as well, because there's so many players that haven't worked on it before. They haven't been in a real what I would call a real program that has good design behind it. Like I said, most 13, 14-year-olds, they're doing the same. They're even doing the same static stretching that we were doing 25 years ago, where now we watch the older guys, the high school, college, big league guys, most of them are getting loose with dynamic warm up, but you still go watch a youth game and they're just still doing static stretching before the game, and they're not really treating their body, with as much, they're not using all the information available, I think. So when you put a younger guy on a proper program that addresses his weak areas, man, holy cow, they can get better really quickly. Like I mentioned a little while ago, I just started working with a younger guy, a guy that's a little bit younger than I usually work with, and he's super tight through his hamstrings and hips. It's just how his body is at 12 or 13 years old. And once we kind of got him on a real routine, and he's been great. He's worked hard. He's put in the work. Absolutely, I give him credit for that. But man, he's made some pretty incredible gains very quickly, just because he's able to get in positions that he wasn't able to get in before.
Yeah, and it could, those young guys, it's always can be strength as well. Because I see a lot of kids across the age distribution, and it's interesting how the problems that you deal with in your 12-year-olds can be vastly different than the issues you deal with in your 16-year-olds, because the 16-year-olds may be more functionally strong, or the 18-year-olds may be more functionally strong, but they haven't done any stretching or any mobilization in years, and now they're stiff and they can't touch their toes, and they just had a big growth spurt. Whereas these 11-year-old kids may have better motion, and they just can't control it, or they don't have access to it readily. And I think that's, I've always had the opinion that, like, you should get looked at once a year minimum if you're an athlete by a movement professional who knows what they're doing, whether that's your strength and conditioning coach. They really got to know what they're doing. But, I advocate a lot for a sports physical therapist to do a screen on you once a year. So, hey, these are the things that I'm working on. These are the things that I may need to do a little bit differently in my program. And that way, I have an approach. And if you're not getting assessed at least once a year, just to make sure you've met some requisite levels of flexibility and strength, as well as rotator cuff strength, I think you're doing yourself a disservice as an athlete. And I see guys at higher levels of the game that never get looked at. Division I baseball, and I won't say what programs or where, but I see guys come back and they're like, yeah, I've never done any flexibility training. I've never done any mobility training or mobilization. And it's like, you can't touch your toes. You can't get into a squat position. It's crazy.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And well, I feel like I have taken the time and I've tried to learn more than maybe some coaches out there about mobility and the kinesiology and anatomy and that whole side of it. I'm by no means an expert, so I absolutely defer to guys like you and other specialists, and always encourage players to get checked out by a professional, because look, at the end of the day, I may know something about the topic, and I may know a few key things, but I'm spending most of my time studying catching specific things, whether it be, the mechanics or what are the trends, what's going on. A portion of my time gets developed or gets spent on the human body and how it moves and the movement patterns. But that's not the majority of my time. So there's always somebody out there that's better. And that's one thing that I think coaches need to do. And I've always encouraged guys to expand their network. If you go to a coaching conference or a clinic, or you're at a state convention, or whatever it may be, meet as many guys as possible, because, man, you can always learn from other guys and talk to other guys. And that's why, just like you and I getting on a podcast like this, I'm grateful, because now, hey, I might hit you up after this when I have a question, and now I have one more contact in my book that I can reach out to and ask. So I'm a firm believer in expanding your network and using professionals that are kind of outside your scope of knowledge. That's one of the things that's in the amateur baseball landscape now. A lot of players, a lot of the elite players, to use that buzzword, they do have kind of a team built around them, where they have their team and they have their coaches they go to, but they also may have a specific skills coach. Maybe it's a catching coach, maybe it's a hitting coach, maybe it's a pitching coach. Some of these guys are seeing nutritionists. Some of these guys are seeing physical therapists. Maybe it's a chiropractor. I don't know exactly what it is, but the point is, these guys are building teams around them because they understand how important it is to take care of my body. I think there was an article that came out a year or two ago, and this is not the best example, but it is an example where LeBron James, I think they said he spends like over $1 million on his body a year between nutritionists and therapy. Now, whether that works or not, that's maybe a different conversation. But the point is, he has bought into investing in his body and investing in the team that is around his body. And well, I know that's not right for every 12, 13, 14-year-old. We do need to understand that what the elite guys are doing is they're taking care of their bodies. They're reaching out to professionals who understand what's happening, and they're getting their feedback and implementing their programs.
Yeah, you touched on a lot of important things there, and interesting things. But as the coach, you're the one that's handling a lot of this stuff. Guys are coming to you that are 15 years old, and they don't necessarily have access to a sports psychologist and a nutritionist that are right there. So you're handling a lot of these questions, which is the job of the coach. And I think we overlook that a lot, especially from the medical perspective. And I'm communicating with doctors and orthopedic surgeons all the time, but also the rehabilitation professionals. And it's like, hold on, the coaching job is quite a bit more difficult than you guys make it seem. It's not these lowly coaches. A lot of times is the way they're kind of alluded to, but it's like, well, the coach is almost like the master puppeteer, and we're kind of the other tools in the toolbox. But moving on from that, just going into some catching specific stuff, which I know people are going to tune in to listen to a little bit of this. You've put out a lot of great material and resources and information. But where do coaches need to start? Because like I said in the beginning, I think this is an overlooked aspect of the game, and I never caught myself, but I look at the structure of how a lot of practices are laid out, and I see the two groups that are neglected the most as the pitchers and the catchers. And there's so much that can be done. Like, it's not about catching in ground balls. There's a ton of things that go into training a catcher, because I'd argue that the pitcher is the most important, and shortly followed by that is the catcher. As far as the game, you got to have a catcher that's able to catch the ball, number one, but be able to frame pitches, steal your strikes, block balls from getting to the backstop, kind of command the field as well. I mean, they have a lot of responsibility.
Yeah, and that's a great question. Where do coaches start? Holy cow! As soon as you start, you're not even halfway done with your question, and the wheels are turning. Like, oh my gosh, where do we start? There's so many different things going on. So I think the best way, maybe, Andy, is, I hope it's not too complicated, but I like to almost break it down into two subcategories. I think one, you have the physical component, also have the mental component as well, which both are important, and it's hard to say which one's more important. Maybe you have the guys that say mental, is 95% of the game or whatever. But they're two different things, and they're very different. And sometimes at different ages and different levels, certain things get neglected. For example, I think, again, as I watch more younger baseball, and I say younger, pre-high school, and the reason I start watching more pre-high school guys is because that's where the recruiting is going. The recruiting is sped up. It's no longer are you just getting recruited as a junior or senior and signing after your senior year. Now guys are getting earlier and earlier, so just by default you start paying attention to younger guys. So with the younger guys, one of the things that I've noticed is, even the guys who are really good baseball players and really good catchers, a lot of times they're behind. And I say, with baseball IQ, I don't mean mentally, I don't mean they're not smart, I don't mean they're not intelligent, but with just knowing the game and understanding the game and understanding the strategy behind the game, I think we need to do a better job teaching these guys, particularly at a younger level. If you ask most high school coaches or ask most college coaches, I've run this poll on Twitter and I've had conversations, I think it's safe to say that most people agree with, the player gets to you, where is he most efficient? I don't care if you ask high school coaches or college coaches. I think most of them say their knowledge, IQ. They're just, their ability to know what's going on and know what they're supposed to do and know how the game is supposed to be played. That's where a lot of guys are behind. And part of that's just the structure of amateur baseball now, where guys are spending a lot more time playing games versus practicing. So teaching the game, teaching the strategy, teaching all the things involved with that, from bunt defenses to how is to when is a steal situation, when a sacrifice bunt. That's where we kind of need to attack it on the baseball IQ side, is just teaching the game. And then we have the other physical side, which I think most catching coaches would probably agree. The three most important skills, like you mentioned earlier, is receiving. I think everybody says receiving is number one. I don't think that's going to go away. I think blocking is probably number two, and throwing is probably number three. A lot of times, as you're going through the recruiting process or you're going through the tryout process, what gets you noticed, or might be the thing that they're writing down, because the coaches have a stopwatch or a pop time, and it's easy to measure. It's a lot harder to measure, blocking ability or receiving skills. So I think more focus naturally gets drawn to the throwing, just because it can easily be measured and a number can be associated with it. But the receiving is the most important. I don't think we can argue that. And if there's anybody out there listening and they're already preparing their counter argument that they're going to say, well, in the big leagues, the electronic strike zone is coming. I would absolutely agree that the electronic strike zone is coming, and the robo umps, if you want to call them that. But that I don't think that's going to happen at any point, probably, or the near or midterm future at amateur baseball, just because of the costs. So even if that is implemented at the big league level, well, the guys that are in college, the guys that are in high school, the guys that are younger than that, they still have to be really good receivers, even if in the strike zone, or even if the major league strike zone changes because of electronic technology. The younger guys are going to have to be able to excel receiving and be able to not only just catch the ball, but catch the ball well. And there's a very big distinction there. That again, I see a lot of times with younger guys, they think that I caught the ball, I did my job. And when you talk to the older guys, the really skilled receivers, there's a big difference between catching the ball and catching the ball well, and being able to manipulate it and being able to present it. So I know that was a long answer to a short question, but if I had to break it down into two areas, the baseball IQ, I would start with that, and then the physical stuff, I'd start with the receiving, blocking, and throwing, and then kind of move on from there.
Let's unpack what you just went through, because there was a ton of great information in there. The first thing is, I absolutely agree as far as robo-umps and the electronic strike zone, because if you look at radar guns, how long have we used radar guns for measuring every pitch in the MLB? It's been a long time. We don't even see that at every level of college yet. I remember when I played, it was like going to the Perfect Game, the new Perfect Game complex they had just put down, and I want to say it was Georgia or wherever, somewhere down south on our spring trip. It was like, oh wow, they're actually measuring it every single throw. Otherwise, you have a guy sitting behind the dugout or behind the backstop doing it. So we haven't even seen radar guns, which is much more cost effective. They're not at every youth game. They're not set up automatically at every youth stadium, and those things are, many years in advance. Now you're talking about technology that's at a completely different level in terms of the cost. It's not going to be even. I'll be surprised if it's even at the college level for quite a while, just because they may use it at in the super regionals or something like that, or the College World Series, but just to get it for every game and then to have somebody upkeep it, that's a big cost, especially with baseball, which at the college level just doesn't bring in the amount of money that the football or basketball programs bring in.
Great point. And I love the analogy about a radar gun. I mean, you're exactly right. Radar guns now, they're very affordable for the most part. I mean, I still think the Stalkers are probably the gold standard. They're going to be, $1,500 or so, maybe a little bit more than that now. But then you have very good other methods, like a pocket radar. For $300 or $400, you get something that's very acceptable level of precision, with that. You don't see those all over the place, so how would we get the technology to have the automated strike zone in amateur baseball? Yes, and the upper levels of Division I, a lot of the schools, have a TrackMan now. Definitely not all of them, or maybe even the majority of them, but there are more that are implementing that type of technology. But when you talk about the I don't hate to say the bottom 250 schools, but the bottom 250 schools, that's a very big expense for them. And it's not just buying the hardware. If you have an advanced system like an automated strike zone, you have to have somebody to man that strike zone as well and make the adjustments and make sure it's calibrated. That's probably not something that the pitching coach is doing on a Thursday afternoon, getting ready. You need a dedicated staff to run those systems and run those programs. So now you're talking about not just the expense of the hardware, but you're also talking about the human element being involved as well. So it's just not cost effective now. And I would imagine it'll be long after I'm gone that something like that would ever get implemented. At a widespread basis, like youth and amateur baseball.
Yeah, let me backtrack a little bit to what you said a few minutes ago regarding baseball IQ. I felt like I was extremely fortunate in my whole career that I had really great coaches, very knowledgeable coaches, up and through the ranks. And my dad was my coach when I was younger, and my dad was kind of this baseball genius. He played, I believe it was NAI, but the school was Saginaw Valley State University, which is a Division II school now. And I think it may have been NAI when he played. I'm not 100% sure, but he learned from good coaches when he was younger, and then he continued to coach high school baseball and those sorts of things up through, and then he ended up coaching us, and he was never really the head coach because he just wanted to coach the baseball side of things. But one thing that I really remember him doing, and I didn't think a lot of it, it was just the normal at the time, but then seeing other programs and seeing things on different teams, I noticed, wow, there's a big difference here, which was like we had dedicated time to go over basically baseball IQ type stuff, situations. We went over what you do when you're on this base, what happens here, and it was drilled into our head, and everybody had to understand it, and then you had to implement it. It was just like, it was so repetitive in terms of it's just drilled into your head. The cardinal rules of here's the cardinal rules of baseball. Here's what you do when you're on third base. And what I've noticed, and I talked to Peter Caliendo on the podcast, either his podcast or mine, because we did an episode each. We talked about this, which was you've got guys that are in the MLB, in minor league baseball, and in college baseball who don't even really know how to bunt or run the bases, and they've gotten to the level because they're such a good athlete and they're such a good talent, and they have this projectability where they have a ceiling that's up here, but they don't necessarily understand the intricacies of baseball IQ and the fundamentals of the game. As far as you can steal so many bases and so many runs from guys just by running the bases properly. But going into, and I keep jumping back to the catching aspect of things, but the catcher-pitcher dynamics are extremely important as well, especially with the catcher. He's got to be able, he's the commander of the field. He's looking at the whole field. He's got to really understand the game at a level that you maybe don't have to understand if you're a left fielder. But that's certainly an area that as a coach, I think we need to place more emphasis on, is just, hey, baseball IQ, let's go through and let's break down all of these different situations, and then let's practice these situations and put some time pressure on us, put some contextual environments around us where it's game like, and we have to practice. We have to work through these scenarios, but we also have to understand what the goal is too. And hey, if I see this, I'm reacting in this way. If I see that, I'm reacting in that way. As opposed to, hey, I'm just going to rely on pure athleticism, and we're going to hope we throw our mitts at them and win the game.
Yeah, I mean, I remember having, I'll try to keep this PG, but I remember having a few moments in my career, and I remember I had a few of them when I got to Ole Miss, and we're doing things and we're going over things, and I'm kind of scratching my head like, how did I not know that? Like super basic and super simple, and it makes perfect sense when it's explained to you and you realize it. But I've never been taught this before. I didn't know that. I had no idea. I think the best example is we were talking about bunt coverages, and in this situation, when is the opposing team trying to bunt it to first base? When are they trying to bunt it to third base? And when you sit down, okay, that makes sense. And it prepares you for the game when you understand what the other team is trying to do. But for a young guy, and young catchers especially, because that's anytime I start working with a new guy and we kind of start going over the mental game type stuff or the baseball IQ type stuff, I usually ask them, I'll say, hey, all right, there's a runner on first base. The opposing team is going to sacrifice him over. Where's the opposing team going to bunt the ball? More than 9 times out of 10, they say down the third base line. And and I try to walk them through it and talk to them. So I say, okay, well, let's imagine this. There's a runner on first base. Nobody else is on. What's the first baseman doing? Well, he's holding him on. Okay. What's the third baseman doing? He's creeping in. Okay, so if the third baseman's creeping in and the first baseman's 90 feet away, where does it make more sense to bunt? Well, we're going to bunt the ball to first base. That's what the rules of baseball tell you to do. But I remember as a player, not knowing that until I was much older than I like to admit. But that's an area that, man, so many young guys they just struggle with because they've never been taught. And again, I wouldn't necessarily say not their fault, but they've never been taught it before. You can't expect somebody to know something they've never been taught. But those are absolutely the things that we need to work on, guys. We got to teach them the game, teach them, how it's supposed to be played, what the opposing team's trying to do. It helps you a lot when you have a better understanding of, okay, when is the opposing team trying to steal second base? When are they trying to steal a base here? Versus, again, you ask a young guy, hey, when is the other team going to steal? When they have a fast guy at first base. And it's actually a lot more complicated than that. So those are a couple of, broad examples, but I think it is a good example of how we can help the younger guys, get start to learn the game.
Yeah, and how fun is running laps in an indoor gym? I mean, that's what a lot of these teams are doing right now, especially these Fed ball teams. It's like we practice year round. It's like, well, kind of. You run laps, around the gym and do these ladder drills or something for 50% of your practice in the winter in the gym. Because I'm here in Michigan. It's cold. We're inside for at least half the year. It's like that whole time can be spent on situational learning, teaching your guys what happened. Okay, let's go to here. Let's walk down to first base. We got an infield setup. Okay, what are you going to do as a base runner? Okay, now we have our catchers. Okay, what are we going to do as a catcher in this scenario? Just like you're saying, and we're indoors. It's like there's a lot of skill work that you can do indoors, but there's a lot you can do in terms of situational learning, as opposed to working on some sort of conditioning once a week that's not going to make any impact on, maybe psychologically it helps, I don't know, but beyond the minor psychological benefit of saying, oh, I've been working hard, and we're wasting so much of our indoor practice time. And we've talked about the baseball IQ side of things, and I liked your tiered list there because even though I only really work on the throwing aspect of things, I believe the receiving aspect is the most important for catchers, because as a pitcher, I realized the benefit of it. And I even remember in college, we had a younger catcher who had a great arm, and there was a great likelihood he was going to throw guys out. Most games, I don't know how many games he went without throwing at least one guy out, but he threw a lot of guys out. But we had another upperclassman who, interestingly enough, like we actually got into a little bit of a fight. Like my first fall ball season as a freshman, he was a junior or something, but just phenomenal receiving. And he didn't throw a lot of guys out, didn't have the most powerful arm in the world, but just loved to throw for him, because I'm like, every time I throw to him, I get 15, 18 more strikes in any game. And no balls got to the backstop. It seemed like it was just like, boom. And he was just like, everything was so, it was just a lot of finesse. It didn't throw a lot of guys out. I'm like, I'll take those guys stealing. I'll take some of that. As long as he's stealing me strikes, I get ahead in the count. I have a pitcher's count instead of a hitter's count, and I'm going to get a strikeout here or there stolen, and I'm putting guys on their back foot.
Yeah, and I want to almost backtrack on what I said earlier. I just want to clarify. When I talk about probably receiving and blocking being the most important, and receiving and throwing being third, I don't think those are 1, 2, and 3. I think they're 1A, 1B, and 1C. Very important, and I think almost even more so at the lower levels, which, let's be honest, is the majority of baseball. I mean, there's only 30 big league teams, but there's a lot of high schools, a lot of colleges, a lot of travel teams, a lot of younger guys. It can still be a very big part of those teams' success from the catching standpoint. I think a great example is if you coach a high school team and you have a catcher that has a plus arm and he really throws well, that shuts down a lot of attempts. Again, at the college level, everybody's a little bit better. Everybody's a little bit more advanced. The game is a little bit faster in general. But at the lower levels, like I say, high school, for example, holy cow, if you've got a catcher that throws, really well, that can take away an entire part of the opposing team's strategy. And you don't, even the best throwers in high school, they don't throw the most guys out because they have so few attempts. If you have a really good guy behind the plate, it's almost like, okay, we're not trying that today. We're not even. So there is a lot of value, I think, in having a guy who throws really well. And I think different skill sets can kind of, move ahead of others at different age groups. If you're 12 or 13 and you're just now getting acclimated to a big field, well, everybody's playing on the bigger field for the first time. We're probably not throwing out a whole lot of guys at second base anyway. So maybe at 12 or 13, blocking might be a little bit more important than throwing is. But then you get a little bit older and you get to high school. And again, I'm not going to say blocking is not important, but I will say if you have a catcher with a plus arm, he can kind of eliminate or shut down, opposing team strategy on the bases. So at different ages, different skill sets, I think, kind of, rise to the top. But no doubt, throwing is very important. I spend a lot of time talking about it. I'm interested in it. I like to research it and study it, and I like to watch what the best guys, in the world do when they throw.
Yeah, yeah, that's certainly a good point. The younger guys are going to throw more balls in the dirt. They're going to throw more balls around. And the higher level baseball you get into, the more precise and accurate pitchers are, the less balls you're going to have to worry about blocking. The less honestly, they throw faster and everything else, but if you can steal 10 pitches in a 7 inning game or a 6 inning game, that could be a huge difference, especially you're not going to throw a lot of guys out at the younger ages with the way the base paths are and that sort of thing. So that certainly makes sense. I always, as a pitcher, I always felt so much more comfortable throwing to just throwing to those guys that could steal me strikes. And I felt like no matter what, I felt like if I threw it around the zone, it was going to look really good. And I mean, we track, you track your strikes, balls, you track everything like that. And I ended up with lot less walks, even less hit by pitch because guys were getting in there and getting out of there faster. But certainly more strikeouts because you're ahead in the count all the time. And I mean, maybe you could touch on this, but I always felt like posture as the catcher, like how you set up behind the dish was a big factor because, I remember throwing to those guys that were, I don't know, smaller guys, but they made themselves really small, where they were really, the knees were in close, and you're in a count, or you're in a situation where you don't even have a base runner on, and the knees are in close, and the catcher looks smaller. Perception wise to the umpire, I think that. I mean, my experience has been, I feel like that plays a big role. I don't know what your thoughts are, if you have any better statistics on that, because I'm going purely on, anecdotal, but.
Yeah, sure. Well, and I would say the stances and setups have probably been the hottest topic among the catching community over the past 2 to 3 years. If you look on the big leagues or you watch the guys on TV, there's a lot more of those guys that are utilizing a one knee down stance, versus the traditional stance where both feet are on the ground and both knees are in the air. Guys have one knee down and they're in much different stances. And I know all your viewers might not be super into the catching side, so I'll try to be brief, but I'll explain it briefly. The reason that most guys are doing that is because they're finding that they're better able to steal strikes at the bottom of the strike zone, which in the big leagues, those umpires, overall, they're really good. I know they catch, a lot of heat on the internet or on Twitter whenever they miss a call, whenever they blow something, but overall, they're really good. The pitches that they're or the direction they're likely to expand the strike zone is much more down than it is left and right. If they miss a ball, 2 balls off the plate in the big league, that's like unheard of. Guys don't miss balls 2 balls off the plate. However, where you can expand the strike zone as a catcher and pitcher is at the bottom of the strike zone. So guys are getting a little bit lower. They're still providing good targets. We're finding that guys are still able to block and throw out of these positions. I think a lot of people may disagree with or may there may be some pushback there, but a lot of guys at the big league level are able to block and throw out of those stances. Maybe not everyone, but a lot of guys can, and it puts them in a better position to receive the low strike. Now, I do think it's important to, like I said, also talk about the differences between the big leagues and high school and younger. I would say typically in lower levels of baseball, when every game is not broadcast on TV and the umpires are may not getting electronic, strike zone reports after the game to let them know which pitches they missed and which ones they got correctly. I would say amateur umpires are more likely to expand the zone east and west or left and right versus up and down sometimes because they feel like they can get away with it. It's maybe harder to see from the dugouts, from the coach's perspective. So is the strategy a little bit different? I would say a little bit. I don't think it's drastically different. I don't think we're playing completely different games, but I do think, strategically there are different approaches you can take at different levels. And for me, it makes sense at the big league level. Hey, let's steal everything off the bottom of the strike zone. Let's try to expand that as much as possible. And in the college game as well, we absolutely want the low strike, no doubt about it. But I think there's more room to expand on the left and right side or the inside, outside of the plate and get those strikes. So again, I'm not saying that the one knee stance does not work at the college level. Just trying to explain, why certain guys are adopting it and what they're doing. Because yes, stances are very heavily debated nowadays, and it's fun to listen to and it's fun to be a part of. It's actually something I've tried to pay attention to over the past year specifically. Watching different guys' stances and watching how they're setting up behind the plate, and then recognizing, hopefully how it receiving.
That makes sense from a visual perceptual model as far as low pitches because that's much more difficult, especially as the ball's coming in faster to determine the height of the pitch as opposed to it's way out there. I can easily see the trajectory of the ball there, as the umpire. So that certainly makes sense to me. As far as how we start to train our catchers, I mean, we've touched on a lot of things. Number one is let's make sure that you're able to acquire the positions that you need to acquire behind the plate and give yourself movement options from the mobility, stability, flexibility perspective of, hey, what positions can I get into to make sure that I have the most movement options as the catcher? And talked about how you can drastically alter your game in terms of understanding the game better and understanding the situations better because you're getting a step on everybody. Just like you were talking about with your example, it's like, all right, first baseman's sitting back and they're going to bunt it down the first base line. I already know as a catcher, I've already got half a step on that bunt because I have a good idea of where it's going, and it might not always end up going there, but the third baseman's got my back if it ends up going down that other line. So baseball IQ, flexibility, strength, receiving, improving your ability to receive is certainly a big one. And I think it ties in closely with your ability to throw because a lot of times we're throwing dependent on the position or depending on the location of the pitch. If the pitch draws me a certain way, I'm going to have to alter how I move through the rest of the movement to complete a throw or a back pick or trying to throw somebody out, stealing. And that's really where I've spent time is on the throwing side of things, mostly with guys who are, my pop time is really low and my velocity is really low down to second base. I need to try to cut that down. And a lot of times you're dealing with throwing mechanics that are way, way off. But the ability to receive is always intriguing to me, especially because you'll see catchers who are setting up in the middle and then they're reacting to a pitch and they're pushing them out of the strike zone at a high school level and below where they're pushing the ball out of the zone and they're I don't know, reverse framing it. I don't know if you have a good term for that, but how do we start to improve those guys? I mean, the low hanging fruit for those guys is certainly let's get your eyes checked first, right? Let's see an optometrist and make sure your vision is corrected if it needs to be, because I think a lot of times kids aren't getting their eyes checked regularly enough and they're not seeing the ball as good as they should be. But from a visual perceptual side and a reaction standpoint, what are a few things that you're implementing?
Well, I love the vision and reaction aspect of it. I think that's a really important thing that gets overlooked a lot. For me, I would say the biggest principle is I want to incorporate reaction training and visual training into our practices. I think, again, the best example I can give is I get emailed very frequently from a parent who would say something along the lines of, hey, coach, my son blocks fine in practice. As soon as we get him to the games, he just doesn't block as well. There's a lot of balls going to the block stop. What do you think's going on? What can I do to help? And I always answer with a question. My question is, well, what percentage of your practice time does he know where the ball is coming? And so what I mean by that is typically when we go through blocking practice, and this is throwing or blocking any skill really, it's just the general principle. Typically, especially at younger levels, guys are doing blocking practice. Say, hey, I'm throwing 10 down the middle, block these 10. Now I'm throwing 10 to your glove side, go block those 10. Now I'm gonna throw 10 to your arm side, go. When we're completely eliminating the reaction and the decision-making aspect from the drill, which is for a blocking for that drill is probably more important than the mechanical side. If you have average mechanics and above average ability to read it and react, you're probably going to be better than the guy who has above average mechanics and an average ability to read and react. So I always ask guys, how much of it is predetermined? Like, hey, I'm throwing 10 in the dirt, down the middle, get ready to block it. Versus, hey, I'm going to throw you 10, half are going to be in the air, half are going to be in the dirt. You've got to read it and react. If it's in the air, I want you to receive it properly. If it's in the dirt, I want you to block it and recover it. So I think, and again, that's a big umbrella. There's a lot of different things we can talk about in that, but I think it's just an important concept to understand that inside the training environment, we have to have guys react more. We have to have them make decisions because we're asking them to make decisions in a game. And a lot of times, especially at younger levels, guys just never practice that at all. If we were talking about hitting, it would be the same idea as, hey, if all your batting practice is just taking a BP fast miles an hour in a cage, and now we ask you to step into a game and the guy's throwing 85, 90, he's mixing up changeups and curveballs and sliders. That's two completely different going on there. It's one to work on the mechanical aspect, the swing. It's another thing to work on the hitting approach and identifying pitches and pitch selection and hitting the pitches that you want to hit. So those are two examples, but it's no different for any other skill. That's one of my biggest gripes about showcases and showcase pop times, and I'm not going to get off on a tangent about that, but I think one of the problems is when kids are evaluated in showcases, they always say like, all right, here you go, I'm throwing you 5, get ready to throw, and the catch is prepared, and he cheats, and he's up, and again, we don't have to get in that entire discussion. And then when you get into a game, you don't. Now, hopefully, as a coach, we've done a good job preparing them with the baseball IQ and explaining what's a still situation, what's a hit and run situation, so they can kind of prepare for it and expect it. But at the end of the day, you still don't know when the guy takes off until the pitcher and he starts running towards second base. So we have to be able to react, recognize that, and we need to incorporate that into our training.
I like the way you put that. I'm thinking about some contextual ways or contextually specific ways that you could start to train some of this stuff. And if you're working on the technical aspects, like you said, it may be in a different environment slightly than what you're going to encounter in the game. But being here in the north, the sooner that you can get outside, the better, because the ball is perceived differently in an outdoor environment. But as far as just training reactivity and being able to react to pitches, catching, you're 14 years old, catch some of the 16 you guys, catch some of the 17 you guys that are going to throw at a bit higher level, and it's going to force you to operate at a bit higher level, and then you're going to go back to those guys that are throwing 7 miles an hour slower, and you're just going to be that much better. I remember a couple of the better catchers I played with. They would always go up and like when they're 14 and catch the high school guys. Like, hey, in the 8th grade or 7th grade, it was a great way for them to get in front of the coach. I'm in 7th grade, 8th grade. Can I just help out in the bullpen? Like, if you guys are throwing bullpens, can I just help out and catch some guys? And it certainly challenged them. And then a lot of times for our pitchers, we're having them do different things, and either crow hopping off the mound or throwing a short box. And those things can be, just to give them a little bit different information. But I think a lot of times our catchers don't catch enough. And they spend their time doing static drills, or if they're doing anything at all, they spend their time doing static drills. And you got to perceive the ball like you're going to see it in the game. And if you can do that at a higher level with guys that are throwing faster, throwing game speed, that's a useful tool. I don't know what your thoughts are, on having guys try to catch pitches that they don't necessarily know what pitch is coming. But that would be a pretty advanced way, as long as you feel like you can do it safely.
Yeah, I would say I don't do much of that. I think for me, you always have to weigh the risk versus reward. And it
Yeah,
is
totally.
really difficult when you get crossed up and when you don't know what's coming. So I know there are some coaches out there that experiment with that, and they've tried it and they've implemented some of that. And some guys have told me they have success. And I would say that's one of those things. I'm still kind of in the wait and see type mode. I'm not the earliest adopter, so I'm not going to say that I'm necessarily out there doing that. But I know there are guys who are doing it, and they're saying they have good results from it. It's not, again, it's not something that I've necessarily implemented yet, but I think if I were going to start doing that, I would probably start receiving Incrediballs or receiving some sort of high
Right.
flight ball or a lighter ball, a ball just so that we always want to be super cognizant of injuries. Again, not that we're scared of getting
Absolutely.
hurt, but I think, but I am scared of getting hurt in a training environment by asking a guy to do something that he's not prepared to do. So I would never set up a machine that's pumping, 90-mile-an-hour fastballs and 82-mile-an-hour sliders. I think if you were going to try that, I would just say, hey, just ease into it. And maybe even set the machine further back. So instead of setting it at 50 feet, where a lot of times machines are set up, instead of setting it at 60 feet, hey, maybe in the beginning, maybe we set the machine at 70 or 75 feet, so the player has a little bit more time to read and react, and then we can, gradually get a little bit closer, or gradually make the movement a little bit sharper.
Or
But
behind a
that
screen.
could
Have have the guy
absolutely.
behind a screen, and have a strike zone on the screen, and then you have to react to it. I mean, you're not getting the full aspect of receiving, but you're still getting the visual perceptual aspect of it, of like, okay, boom, I'm trying to react to this, or react to that, just to improve, your visual perception skills and your ability to
Mhm.
react to the pitches, that, like, as opposed to, I think a lot of times it's like guys haven't trained their visual system. So I'm just spitballing around. I don't. That's
No, that
outside of my wheelhouse, I guess. But
No, that is a great drill, and I've seen that, and I've seen it used with a lot of younger guys as well, as they're trying new stances and they're trying to
yep.
get more comfortable. I think it does I think it does a couple things. One, you can really overtrain with that, with the speed, with the velocity. You can really crank it up faster than what you might feel. So if you have a 15-year-old, you might not want to set the machine up at 100 and have him receiving that. But hey, if you wanted to set up a higher velocity as used to, and have him receiving 100, or get the reaction time of receiving 100, yeah, you set up a screen in front of him or a net where the ball's not gonna hit him, and he's just working the glove movement. And so one, that helps guys see more pitches and be able to react, but it's also a big confidence booster too, particularly with young guys who, again, maybe scared of hey, you crank the machine up and you put it on level 10 and it's really coming in there hot. A younger guy may not feel super comfortable, but you got a screen in front of him, and now he's willing to try timing, and then you can gradually ease him into it. So yeah, I'm a big fan of stuff like that.
We're hitting our time limit here. I know you're a very busy man. Um, if you could do two things for me. Number one, if you could provide where everybody can find you online, where they can follow you, because we have catchers that are listening to this, and I know we have a lot of coaches, in particular, who are listening to this, and they need access to your information.
Sure. Well, I appreciate that, and I feel like I'm the easiest guy to get in touch with in the world. I try to reply to all DMs and private messages and emails I get. So my main website is catching-101.com. That's where I have a lot of articles and drills and things like that. I've got a number of other websites as well. One's CatcherCon. I put on a conference every December for catchers and catching coaches, where I bring in a lot of the top catching instructors, and they speak, and we network and learn from each other. And then on social media, Twitter, I'm really at Barksdale. Instagram, I'm a little bit less active, but it's own home or go home. But yeah, if you send me a message, there's a very high likelihood that I'll reply fairly quickly. So I'm pretty easy to get in touch with.
Awesome. And the last thing that I'm going to ask of you is, could you give one thing to leave our listeners with, as far as one thing they need to study, one thing they need to implement into their practice, or one thing they should start to think about as far as training catchers goes, and getting catchers to perform,
Well,
at the highest level
yeah.
they can?
You got it. Well, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. So since you're a throwing guy, and we definitely talked about throwing some, I want to give a throwing tip in a way that we can maybe improve our training. I think for catchers specifically, there are really two very different aspects. When we're trying to throw guys out at second base, and we're trying to improve our pop time and get more runners out, there's a couple different things to look at. One, it's the velocity and the arm strength. We absolutely should train guys to throw harder. I think that's well documented in the pitching world. Guys are training to throw harder. I'm a firm believer that you don't just shy away from it. We should talk about it. We should work on it. We should have a program in place that it may look different for everybody. But arm care bands or plyo balls or prehab work or rehab work or recovery, whatever. There's a lot of things that go into your throwing program, but the velocity side is absolutely very important, and we should work on. On the flip side, there's also the other important aspect, which is the quickness. The ability to exchange and release the ball in a short amount of time. One, because our arm path is short and compact, our feet are quick and efficient, and we're athletic and we're able to move. I think that one of the biggest problems I see is, people will email me or they'll come to camp and they'll say, "Hey, coach, what's the best throwing drill you got?" And I'm like, "Oh man, that's you're setting me up. You're setting it up on tee," because there's not one good throwing drill. I think you need to have drills that work on a very specific part of what you're trying to improve. So if we're trying to improve our throwing, we don't just have general throwing drills. We have drills that improve our footwork. We have drills that improve our exchange. We have drills that improve our arm path. We have drills that improve our arm strength. There's all sorts of different components that are wrapped up into this throwing. And I'd really encourage guys to break it down and be specific as far as, hey, where can I improve? I know I need to throw better, but everybody needs to throw better. But specifically, what does that look like for you? For you, it may need to improve your footwork. For me, I may need to improve my exchange. Another guy may need to improve his velocity. And let's be honest, everybody needs to improve in every area, but there are definitely areas that stand out and stick out as hey, there's a lot of room for improvement in this area for you. I may have a different area where I have a lot of room for improvement. So I would try to be super specific with what you're trying to work on, and just make sure we're not doing general throwing drills, but we're breaking it down even further to where I'm working on this specific aspect, whether it be the arm strength or the exchange or the arm path or the release or the footwork or whatever it is. But don't just think of it in general throwing drills, but think of it much more specifically than that.
Beautiful. Well put. Xan Barksdale, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for tuning in. In the name of Over Athletics, signing off.